The hangar smelled of oil, metal, and dust, the kind of smell that never truly left an army base, no matter how many times the floors were scrubbed. Morgan Hayes stood at the edge of the briefing room, her boots planted firmly, her hands behind, her back in a posture she had practiced 100 times in the mirror. Her heart beat like a hammer inside her chest, but her expression betrayed nothing. This was the moment she had been waiting for. The pilots around her were older, louder, men who carried themselves with the kind of swagger that came only from years of flying machines worth millions of dollars. They joked, traded insults, and smirked at the younger soldiers filtering into the room. But when the commander asked if anyone had a special request for training assignments, the chatter died down, and Morgan's voice cut through the air. "I want the Apache," she said, clear, steady. The silence that followed was sharp enough to cut. Heads turned. A few eyebrows raised. For a moment, no one seemed sure they had heard her correctly. Then, like a crack in the dam, laughter erupted. "The Apache?" One lieutenant chuckled, shaking his head. "That's cute." Another pilot leaned back in his chair, smirking. "Hayes, you do realize we're talking about the AH-64, not some video game joystick. You've barely logged hours on Black Hawks, and now you want the Army's meanest bird?" The room roared with laughter, the sound echoing off metal walls. Morgan stood still, her jaw locked, her gaze forward. She didn't respond. She had prepared for this. She knew they would mock her. Women had flown Apaches before. Wasn't unheard of, but in this particular unit, with this particular group, her request wasn't ambition in their eyes. It was arrogance. "Stick to transport," another voice muttered. "Apaches aren't for show." The sting of their words pressed against her chest, but she refused to show it. Years of discipline told her that silence was stronger than any defensive retort. She forced herself to breathe slowly, evenly, and let their laughter wash over her, like water over stone. What none of them knew was that the request hadn't come from ego. It had come from something carved into her bones. Beneath the collar of her uniform, hidden by her hair, a small tattoo lay inked on the curve of her neck. It wasn't visible now, and she wasn't ready for them to see it. Not yet. The emblem carried a story too heavy, too personal, to throw into a room filled with smirks. Her father's story. She swallowed hard, eyes fixed on the commander at the front of the room. He wasn't laughing, not openly at least. His expression was unreadable, his lips pressed together as if weighing something. He scribbled a note on his clipboard and moved on without comment. The moment was gone, and the room shifted back to its usual rhythm of orders, logistics, and dry humor. But Morgan's words lingered in the air like smoke. When the meeting dismissed, a few pilots passed her with crooked smiles and muttered jokes. One brushed past her shoulder and said, "Dream big, Hayes." She didn't answer. She walked out of the briefing room, her boots striking the concrete floor in steady, measured rhythm. Outside, the sunlight was blinding, bouncing off the rows of aircraft lined neatly along the tarmac. She shaded her eyes, staring at the hulking shape of the Apache parked at the far end. Its silhouette was unmistakable, the double rotors, the aggressive angles, the way it looked less like a machine and more like a predator crouched, ready to strike. Her chest tightened, and her hand instinctively rose to her collar. She pressed her fingers lightly against the hidden tattoo. She could almost hear her father's voice. "Respect the machine, and it will respect you." Morgan's childhood had been built on the sound of rotor blades. She grew up just outside Fort Campbell, in a modest house that shook whenever helicopters passed overhead. To her, it was the sound of safety, of home, of her father coming back after long training flights. He had been larger than life to her, a man whose presence filled every room. He told stories not to boast, but to teach. Stories of missions where precision saved lives, where discipline mattered more than bravado. He flew Apache's machines that terrified some, but to him, they were extensions of will and skill. He taught Morgan to respect them the way one respected fire, powerful, dangerous, but capable of protecting if mastered. She remembered sitting on his lap as a little girl, tracing her finger along the patches on his uniform. "One day, you'll understand," he used to say, tapping the unit insignia on his chest. She had asked him once if girls could fly Apaches too. He smiled, kissed the top of her head, and said, "Anyone who earns it can." The night the knock came on their door, her world cracked. Two men in uniform stood solemn on their porch, their expressions telling her everything before words left their mouths. Her father had been killed in Afghanistan during a mission gone wrong. Details were scarce, but she didn't need them. All she knew was the world suddenly felt too quiet, too empty. At 17, she took his unit insignia and had it inked into her skin, just below her neck. Not for anyone else. For herself. A vow. A reminder that she would carry his legacy forward, even when the weight threatened to crush her. Now, standing on the tarmac years later, she stared at the Apache with fire in her chest. It wasn't just a helicopter. It was her destiny. Laughter from the briefing room still echoed in her ears, but she let it fuel her. She knew she wasn't ready yet. She hadn't logged the hours, hadn't earned the reputation. But she also knew one truth. Every expert had once been dismissed, doubted, or underestimated. She would be no different. Morgan walked toward the barracks, her shadow stretching long across the pavement. Inside, she found her small room, dropped her gear, and sat on the edge of her bed. She pulled a notebook from her drawer, the one filled with schematics, notes, and diagrams of the Apache she had been studying since before basic training. She flipped it open, her pen gliding across the page as she memorized another weapons system. Outside, the sun dipped lower, casting the base in golden light. Somewhere across the airfield, laughter still carried from the pilots who thought she was reaching too high. She ignored it. She had learned long ago that mockery was temporary, but legacy was permanent. She closed her notebook, stood, and looked at her reflection in the mirror above her desk. The tattoo peeked faintly above her collar, just enough to remind her of the weight she carried. "They don't know me yet," she whispered to herself. Her reflection stared back, eyes burning with determination. But they will. The late evening sky over Fort Campbell was streaked with orange and violet, the kind of Kentucky sunset that could almost trick a soldier into believing the world outside the base was calm. Morgan Hayes sat cross-legged on the thin mattress of her barracks room, a small desk lamp casting a pool of light across her open notebook. Her pen scratched furiously. Diagrams of the H-64 Apache sprawled across the pages in neat lines. Every gear, every system, every weapon schematic, she knew them better than she knew the back of her own hand. She pushed her hair to one side, revealing the black ink etched against her skin, just below her collarbone and wrapping slightly toward her neck. The tattoo wasn't big or flashy. It didn't need to be. The insignia of the 160th Special Operations Aviation Regiment carried more weight than size ever could. To others, it might just look like a design. To her, it was blood, loss, and promise. Her father's promise. Growing up, Morgan's life was framed by the shadows of helicopters. Their thumping rotors rattled the windows of her childhood home. In Clarksville, just outside the gates of Fort Campbell, some kids had lullabies. She had the distant hum of Apaches slicing across the night sky. It was a sound that reassured her. Her father was up there, doing what he did best. She adored him. Captain Daniel Hayes wasn't the kind of man who puffed his chest or boasted about medals. He was quieter than most soldiers, preferring to let his actions speak. When he was home, he filled their kitchen with stories not war stories about kills or danger, but lessons about teamwork, discipline, and the weight of responsibility. Flying an Apache isn't about ego, he told her once as they sat on the back porch, watching the sun sink behind the trees. It's about respect. Respect for the machine, respect for the people you protect, and respect for the crew who trusts you with their lives. She had been 12 then, legs dangling off the porch steps, her small hands resting on his flight helmet. She remembered asking him if girls could fly Apaches, her voice tinged with both curiosity and doubt. He smiled in that gentle way only fathers could, kissed the top of her head, and said, "Anyone who earns it can." That promise had lived inside her ever since. But promises didn't stop the knock at the door. She could still see it vividly. The day two soldiers in crisp uniforms stood on their porch, their hats in their hands, their faces carved in stone. Her mother broke before the words even left their mouths, collapsing against the doorframe. Morgan stood frozen, the world tilting. Beneath her feet, the words were muffled, like hearing through water. Killed in action, Afghanistan. Mission compromised. At 17, she pressed her palms against her ears, as if refusing to hear could undo the truth. But nothing could. The world felt too quiet without his laugh, too still without the thrum of his boots in the hallway. That night, she sat in her room with his patches spread across her bedspread. She traced the insignia of his unit again and again, until the fabric grew warm under her fingers. She made herself a vow. If I can't hear the sound of his Apache anymore, then I'll make sure the world hears mine. The next week, she went to a tattoo parlor in town, still reeling from grief. The artist, a middle-aged veteran with ink covering his own arms, asked if she was sure. She nodded, her eyes dry for the first time in days. When the needle buzzed against her skin, she clenched her fists and welcomed the sting. Pain was temporary. The symbol would last forever. When it was finished, she stood before the mirror, the fresh lines stark and black against her pale skin. She touched it gently, her chest aching, but her spine straighter than before. It wasn't rebellion. It wasn't for show. It was a vow carved into flesh. Years later, as she sat in her barracks, the same tattoo felt heavier than ever. To her peers, she was just Morgan Hayes, a young pilot clawing her way through the ranks. They didn't know her history, didn't know her ink, didn't know the bloodline of discipline and courage coursing through her. They saw ambition. She felt duty. Closing her notebook, she rose and crossed to the small window overlooking the flight line. In the fading light, the hulking silhouettes of helicopters stretched across the tarmac. The Black Hawks and Chinooks looked massive, but it was the Apache at the far end that caught her gaze. Even sitting still, it looked alive, dangerous, like a predator crouched in tall grass. Her chest tightened. One day, she thought, one day, that will be mine. The next morning, training hit hard. Morgan was up before dawn, running laps around the base as the sky shifted from black to gray. Sweat plastered her hair to her forehead, but she pushed harder. Every mile she ran, she imagined her father running beside her, his long stride steady, his voice in her ear. Discipline beats talent when talent gets lazy. In the hangar, she kept to herself. She studied checklists, memorized emergency procedures, and spent long hours in simulators. Most nights, she was the last one to leave. Some of the guys noticed, tossing comments her way. Trying to impress someone, Hayes? Careful, you'll burn yourself out before you even touch an Apache. She thinks she's Top Gun. The laughter didn't sting the way it had before. Now it only reminded her that they didn't know what she carried. She wasn't working for their approval. She was working for the memory of a man who had died with honor. Still, the weight of their doubt pressed on her shoulders. Every time she heard their laughter echo down the hall, she touched her tattoo, grounding herself. Her father's words came back. Anyone who earns it can. Weeks passed in a blur of sweat, study, and repetition. One night, long after most had gone to bed, Morgan remained in the simulator bay. The glowing screens lit her determined face as she practiced maneuvers again and again. She miscalculated once, twice, corrected, then repeated until the motion flowed naturally. An instructor passing by stopped, arms crossed. "Still at it, Hayes?" "Yes, sir." He studied her for a moment, then nodded slowly. "Keep that. Fire. Machines don't care what anyone thinks. They only care if you're prepared." His words lit something inside her. For the first time since her request had been mocked, she felt seen not as a joke, not as a dreamer, but as someone grinding her way forward. When she finally shut down the simulator, exhaustion pressed against her bones. But as she walked back to her room, the Apache no longer felt like a distant dream. It felt like a mountain she was already climbing, one step at a time, and she wasn't going to stop. Back in her room, she sat at the mirror, pulling her hair. Aside, the tattoo glowed faintly under the lamplight. She studied it, tracing the lines with her fingertip. "They don't understand," she whispered, her reflection staring back at her. "But one day they will." Her eyes hardened, her jaw set. "I'm not asking for permission. I'm earning my place." The hum of helicopters outside carried through her window, a lullaby she'd known since childhood. She closed her eyes, imagining her father's voice, steady and sure, carried in the wind of rotor blades. And for the first time in weeks, she smiled. The first time Morgan stepped into the simulator, the world felt too big. The screens surrounded her, the cockpit's buttons and switches glowing under her fingertips, like a foreign language written in light. She had studied them for months, memorized diagrams until her eyes blurred, but theory and practice were worlds apart. The instructor, a grizzled warrant officer with 20 years in Apaches, leaned against the console. "You ready, Hayes?" His tone carried no warmth, just curiosity, as if he expected her to falter. "Yes, sir," she said, steady though her hands trembled slightly on the cyclic. "Then prove it." The simulation came alive. Rotor blades thumped in her ears, the desert terrain sprawling across the screens. Her heart quickened. She lifted the bird, careful with the collective. The virtual Apache rose unsteady, wobbling like a drunk. Overcorrecting, the instructor barked. Smooth, not jerky. Respected. Morgan clenched her jaw, adjusted, tried again. The Apache steadied. "Better," he muttered. "Now keep it alive." Her days became cycles of grind. Early runs at dawn, push-ups until her arms trembled, hours buried in manuals, and nights spent in the simulator bays, long after others had gone. Some of her peers mocked her behind her back, though not always behind her back. "You think staring at screens will make you a pilot?" One sneered as he passed. "Simulator queen," another laughed. She didn't answer. Instead, she logged. More hours than anyone. Every system navigation, weapons, emergency protocols she drilled until it was muscle memory. When others relaxed at the rec hall, she sat alone, pencil in hand, sketching the Apache's hydraulics or the targeting system's failsafes. She filled notebook after notebook, each page a brick in the wall of knowledge she was building around herself. Some nights, exhaustion pressed so heavy she could barely keep her eyes open. But then she would touch the tattoo on her neck, feel the familiar lines of ink, and her father's words would echo. Discipline beats talent when talent gets lazy. So she kept moving. Weeks bled into months. Morgan's body hardened, her reflexes sharpened. She began to anticipate the machine's needs, reacting before the instructor barked corrections. Emergencies simulated mid-flight engine failures, hydraulic loss, Weapon malfunctions tested her composure. At first, panic clutched her throat. She fumbled, crashed virtually, heard the instructor's sigh. But repetition forged steel. Soon, she flipped switches and adjusted controls with calm precision, the Apache responding like an extension of her own body. The instructor noticed. "Hayes," he said one evening after she shut down the simulator, "you're obsessed." "Yes, sir," she replied. He studied her, the faintest smirk tugging his lips. "Good. That's what it takes." Her first time in the actual cockpit came sooner than expected. The aircraft loomed above her on the flight line. Massive. Imposing. The sun gleamed off its black frame, heat shimmering on the tarmac. Sliding into the seat, she felt dwarfed by its presence. The switches were no longer glowing pixels, but cold, real metal under her hands. "Don't think of it as a machine," her instructor told her. "Think of it as alive. Treat it like it can turn on you if you get sloppy." She nodded, heart hammering, and began her checks. Fingers flew over controls, her voice steady as she called out each system. The rotors thundered, shaking the world around her. When the Apache lifted, the ground shrinking below, she held her breath. Then the sky opened before her. For the first time, she wasn't in a simulator. She was truly flying. Every flight after that tested her limits. She learned the Apache's quirks, its hunger for control, its demand for precision. The smallest mistake, a tilt too sharp, a collective pull too fast, could send the machine lurching. She fought it, mastered it, surrendered to it, until flying became less about forcing and more about listening. Her peers took notice. Some muttered that she was lucky. Others began watching, silent, as she returned from each flight with a quiet confidence. She didn't gloat. She didn't celebrate. She simply moved on to the next challenge. At night, she collapsed onto her bunk, muscles aching, mind racing. Sleep came slowly, her dreams filled with the sound of rotors and her father's voice whispering through the noise. "Respect the machine, and it will respect you." The live-fire exercise was her crucible. The range stretched across the Nevada desert, a wasteland of targets painted bright against the sand. Morgan strapped into the cockpit, helmet snug, HUD flickering with data. Her pulse pounded as she gripped the cyclic. "Targets at 2 o'clock," her instructor's voice crackled. She steadied her breathing, adjusted her sights, and squeezed the trigger. The Apache roared. The 30mm cannon unleashed a storm, ripping through the desert, shattering targets into dust. Her hands moved fluidly, guiding the helicopter, lining up missiles, unleashing fury. Explosions bloomed across the sand, smoke curling into the hot air. Silence filled the cockpit as the last missile streaked across the range. "Not bad, Hayes," the instructor said, his voice softer than usual. "Not bad at all." When she landed, sweat clung to her face, her uniform damp. She climbed down, her legs unsteady, but her eyes blazing. Around her, a few peers exchanged looks, whispers carrying. Some still dismissed her. Beginner's luck. She won't keep it up. She didn't answer. She didn't need to. The targets obliterated on the range spoke louder than she ever could. That night, back in her room, Morgan sat at her desk, staring at the tattoo in the mirror. The ink seemed to glow in the lamplight. "They don't believe in me," she whispered. She thought of her father, his voice, his lessons, his absence. Like a wound that never closed. "But I believe in me." She closed her notebook, shut her eyes, and let exhaustion pull her under. The dream came quickly. Her father in the cockpit of an Apache, smiling as he extended a hand. She reached for him, the machine's rotors roaring overhead, and though she could never quite grasp him, the warmth of his presence filled her chest. When she woke, she felt stronger. Tomorrow, she knew, would bring more mockery, more tests, more long nights. But she was ready, because training wasn't just about flying. It was about forging herself into steel. And steel, once tempered, could not be broken. The Nevada desert stretched endlessly, a barren expanse shimmering under the punishing sun. Heat radiated off the sand, distorting the air in waves that made the horizon seem to dance. Morgan Hayes stood at the edge of the range, helmet tucked. Beneath her arm, staring at the hulking shape of the H-64 Apache. Even grounded, the machine radiated menace. Its narrow fuselage and angled rotor blades gave it the look of a predator, crouched and ready to strike. This wasn't a simulator. This wasn't practice with a plastic cockpit or projected screens. This was steel, rotors, and live ammunition. Her hands tingled with nerves as she slid into the front seat of the cockpit. The interior felt like slipping into the skin of something alive, the tight space wrapped around her, the panels bristling with switches and gauges. She buckled herself in, fingers brushing across familiar controls. The smell of oil and hot electronics filled her nostrils. Behind her, the instructor's voice crackled in her headset. "You ready for this, Hayes?" "Yes, sir," she replied, though her pulse pounded so hard she could feel it in her throat. "We'll see." The rotors began their thunderous spin, shaking the Apache like a living beast waking from slumber. Dust swirled across the tarmac, blinding, choking. The machine lifted with a surge of power, and Morgan's heart soared with it. She steadied her breathing, forcing her hands to stay smooth on the controls. Every tiny movement mattered. Pull too hard, and she'd overcorrect, hesitate, and she'd lose momentum. "Keep it level," the instructor commanded. "Yes, sir." The ground shrank beneath them as the Apache roared skyward. The desert stretched wide and unforgiving, dotted with mock enemy positions. Rusted trucks, painted metal silhouettes, wooden shacks arranged to mimic hostile compounds. Targets. Her. HUD flickered to life, bright green symbols hovering across her visor. She adjusted her sights, the crosshairs locking onto the first shape on the range. "Target's at your 1 o'clock, the instructor said calmly. "Show me what you've got." Her thumb hovered over the trigger. She inhaled, exhaled, then squeezed. The Apache barked with fury. The 30mm cannon beneath her unleashed a torrent of fire, shells raining down on the desert. The mop target erupted into splinters, dust exploding upward in a choking cloud. Adrenaline flooded her veins. "Not bad," the instructor muttered. "Next set." She banked the Apache smoothly to the right, lining up on the next cluster. Her fingers moved with growing confidence, guiding the sight system, adjusting her altitude. She fired again, another explosion, the desert ground vomiting fire and debris. Each shot tightened the knot of nerves in her stomach into something sharper, something like pride. She forgot the laughter, the smirks, the voices that told her she didn't belong. In this cockpit, nothing existed but the machine, the desert, and her focus. Her hands no longer trembled. They flowed. The cyclic and collective felt like extensions of her body. The Apache responded with lethal precision, its cannon shredding everything in its path. "Switch to rockets," the instructor ordered. "Yes, sir." She adjusted, pressed, and unleashed. Rockets streaked across the sky, trailing smoke before crashing into distant targets. Fire bloomed across the sand, smoke curling black against the relentless blue sky. The headset crackled again. This time, there was a pause before the instructor spoke. "You've got good hands, Hayes." The words were few, but to her, they felt heavier than metals. When the exercise ended, she brought the Apache down smoothly, guiding it to the tarmac with care. The rotors wound down, their thunder fading into a dull whine. She sat frozen in the cockpit for a moment, her chest heaving, sweat dripping down her back. The silence after so much noise felt deafening. Finally, she unbuckled and climbed out. The sun hit her like a hammer, but she barely felt it. A few of her peers stood nearby, watching. Some clapped politely. Others just stared. That was luck, one muttered. She won't pull it off again. Morgan ignored them. She wiped the sweat from her brow, squared her shoulders, and walked back toward the hangar. Inside, in the cool shade, she allowed herself a moment. Just one. She leaned against the wall, closed her eyes, and let the images replay. The cannon's fury, the rocket's trails, the destruction blooming across the desert. It wasn't perfection. She knew that. She had made mistakes, small corrections, overcompensations, but she had flown, and she had hit her targets. And that was enough. That evening, she returned to her barracks, collapsing onto her bunk. Her muscles ached from the strain of holding steady through the flight, but exhaustion couldn't dull the fire in her chest. She reached up, fingers brushing against the tattoo on her neck. "Did you see me, Dad?" She whispered into the dim room. She could almost hear his laugh, low and warm. Almost hear his voice telling her he was proud. She opened her notebook, scribbling down everything she remembered from the flight, where she faltered, where she excelled, what needed work. Each note was a step forward, each mistake a lesson. Outside, the desert night cooled, stars glittering. Across the endless black, somewhere across the base, the same voices who had mocked her still whispered, still doubted. But they hadn't been in that cockpit. They hadn't felt the machine bow to her hands. She had. The next day, word spread. Morgan Hayes had handled live fire without freezing, without panicking, without crashing. The laughter quieted. Not gone, but quieter. People still whispered, still muttered about luck and flukes, but their eyes had changed. It was calculation. Now, a measuring of her that hadn't been there before. Some even asked her questions, subtle, as if testing the waters. How'd you handle the recoil? What did you feel lining up that second strike? She answered politely, but never bragged. Respect wasn't earned in a single day. It was earned in every day after. And she was ready to keep earning it. That night, lying awake in her bunk, she replayed the flight again and again. The thrum of the rotors still vibrated in her bones. She thought about her father, about his lessons, about the vow she'd made when she inked his insignia into her skin. She smiled faintly, exhaustion finally pulling her under. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new doubts, new tests. But tonight, for the first time since stepping into that briefing room and asking for the Apache, she felt like she belonged. And belonging was only the beginning. The Nevada sky was blindingly blue that morning, the kind of desert sky that seemed to stretch without end, daring anyone to believe there was something greater than the horizon. On the flight line, Apaches rested in neat rows, hulking machines, of war shimmering with heat mirages. Pilots milled about in clusters, adjusting flight suits, trading jokes, and sneaking glances at the visiting brass. A 4-star air marshal had arrived for the joint exercises, an event that turned the base into a stage where every movement mattered. Officers stiffened their spines, constructors double-checked procedures, and even seasoned pilots whispered in awe. Morgan Hayes, helmet cradled under her arm, moved quietly along the line, her eyes fixed forward. She hadn't sought the marshals' attention, nor did she crave it. All she wanted was another chance in the cockpit, another chance to prove her worth. But fate rarely asked what she wanted. She felt at first the weight of his gaze. The air marshal, tall and broad-shouldered, his uniform sharp against the desert dust, walked with the slow authority of a man who didn't need to speak to command respect. His eyes swept across the pilots like a searchlight, and when they landed on her, she stiffened. He paused. Morgan swallowed, the heat of the sun suddenly unbearable. His gaze dropped not to her hands, not to her helmet, but to the faint ink peeking above her collar. She had forgotten, in her rush, to tug the fabric high enough to conceal it. The insignia was small, but to anyone who knew, it was unmistakable. The black and gray emblem of the 160th Special Operations Aviation Regiment, the Night Stalkers. The Marshal's footsteps slowed. "That tattoo," he said, his voice low yet cutting through the chatter like a blade. Every conversation around them halted. Pilots who had been joking only moments before turned their heads. The desert seemed to grow quieter, the wind stilling, as if the world itself leaned in to listen. Morgan's pulse thundered in her ears. She had always hidden the ink beneath her collar, not out of shame, but out of protection. The story behind it wasn't for mockery, wasn't for idle gossip. It was hers. Her father's. "Yes, sir," she said cautiously. The Marshal tilted, his head, eyes narrowing. "Isn't that the Night Stalker's emblem?" Her hand instinctively rose to her collar. Slowly, she pulled the fabric aside, revealing the tattoo fully. The stylized skull and wings caught the sunlight. A collective murmur rippled through the crowd. The Marshal's face softened, the severity in his eyes melting into something else, something older, heavier. He nodded once, almost imperceptibly. "I flew with your father," he said. The word struck her like a missile. Her chest tightened, her throat dry. You knew him, sir?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't just know him," the Marshal replied, his voice carrying the weight of memory. "I owed him my life. We all did." Around them, silence reigned. The same pilots who had once laughed at her ambition now stared, their expressions shifting from curiosity to shock to something unspoken. The Marshal turned to the watching group, his voice firm. "Your father was a legend. He flew with the kind of courage that changes the tide of battles. Men are alive today because of him." Morgan felt her throat ache. Pride surged through her, but so did sorrow. Her father's absence pressed against her ribs, sharp and relentless, even in this moment of honor. "He carried you in his stories," the Marshal continued, his eyes never leaving hers. "Talked about the little girl who could name every helicopter by sound. The one who begged him to take her to see the flight line, even past bedtime." Heat pricked her eyes. She blinked hard, willing herself not to falter. "He was right." "About you," the Marshal said quietly. The silence that followed was deafening. Then came the whispers, soft at first, growing louder as they rippled through the ranks. "That's Hayes' daughter. No wonder she fights like she does. Night Stalker blood." Some looked ashamed, remembering their laughter. Others looked wary, as though realizing they had underestimated someone carrying a legacy larger than themselves. Morgan stood taller, not out of arrogance, but out of the sudden weight of expectation. She had always flown for herself, for her father, for the promise etched into her skin. But now, under the gaze of the Marshal and the watching pilots, she felt something new responsibility. Later, as the sun dipped lower and the exercises wrapped for the day, Morgan found herself summoned to a debrief with the Marshal. The room was sparse, just a table, 2 chairs, and a stack of after-action reports. The Marshal sat with his hands folded, his eyes studying her like she was a puzzle. "You've done well," he said. "Better than some of the men who've been flying Apaches longer than you've been in uniform." "Thank you, sir," she replied, steadying her voice. "But skill alone doesn't make a pilot," he continued. "It's grit, discipline, knowing when to push and when to pull back." Morgan nodded. "I understand, sir." He leaned back, his gaze flicking briefly to the tattoo again. "I see your father in you, but you're not him. And you shouldn't. Try to be. The Apache doesn't need ghosts in the cockpit. It needs you." The words cut deep, but they also set her free. Yes, sir. When she left the debrief, the desert night had fallen. Stars burned brilliantly above, and the cool air swept away the day's heat. She walked alone along the flight line. The Apaches looming in the darkness like sleeping beasts. Her hand rose to her neck again, fingers brushing the ink. For years, it had been her secret vow. Now, it was no longer hidden. And strangely, she wasn't afraid of that. Her peers' whispers followed her everywhere she went over the next few days. Some were respectful, others hesitant, but all of them different than before. No one mocked her openly. No one smirked when she spoke. The tattoo had spoken for her, louder than any words ever could. But Morgan knew respect wasn't a gift. It wasn't inherited, even from legends. It had to be earned again and again. With every mission, every flight, every breath in the cockpit. That night, as she lay in her bunk staring at the ceiling, she whispered into the dark. "They know now, Dad. They know who I am." She let the silence answer. And in that silence, she felt something shift inside her. She wasn't just carrying a legacy anymore. She was building her own. Tomorrow, the world would still test her. Tomorrow, she'd still need to prove she wasn't just her father's daughter. But tonight, she allowed herself one truth. The tattoo wasn't just ink. It was a torch. And she was ready to carry it. The briefing room was colder than the desert night outside. Fluorescent lights hummed faintly overhead, casting a sterile glow across metal tables lined in rows. The smell of coffee and jet fuel clung to the air, an odd pairing that had become the perfume of every base Morgan had ever known. She sat at the far end, her uniform pressed, her collar pulled tight, though it did little to hide the tattoo the Air Marshal had already recognized. Her hands rested flat on the table, fingers rigid, betraying her tension. The door opened. Boots struck the floor with deliberate rhythm. The Air Marshal entered. He didn't sit immediately. Instead, he walked the length of the room, scanning. Flight logs left open on clipboards, glancing at maps pinned to the wall. His presence alone filled the space, a living reminder of decades of service. Finally, he stopped across from her, pulled out a chair, and sat. Morgan straightened, her heart pounding. For a long moment, he said nothing. His eyes, sharp yet heavy with memory, studied her as if weighing not just her present, but her past and her potential. "You handled yourself well out there," he began, his voice calm, but edged with authority. "Thank you, sir." "Most rookies choke when they hear the Apache breathe for the first time," he continued. "You didn't choke. You pushed." Morgan hesitated. I had to, sir." His brow lifted slightly. "Had to?" "Yes, sir," she said, her voice firmer now. "I asked for the Apache. I knew I couldn't afford hesitation." The Marshal leaned back, his gaze dropping briefly to the faint ink on her neck before returning to her eyes. "I see him in you," he said quietly. "Your father." The words struck deep, sending a rush of warmth and ache through her chest. She clenched her jaw, fighting the pull of memory. "But I need you to hear me clearly, Eyes," he added, leaning forward now, his voice lowering. "You are not your father, and you shouldn't try to be." Morgan swallowed hard. "Sir, He raised a hand, stopping her. "Your father was a great man, a hero. But if you walk into that cockpit chasing his ghost, you won't make it out alive. The Apache doesn't respect ghosts. It respects the pilot sitting in the seat." The truth of his words landed like a stone in her gut. For years, every late-night study session, every simulator drill, every whispered vow had been fueled by the image of her father, his voice, his legacy, his death. She had thought honoring him meant becoming him. But here was a man who had flown. Beside him, who had lived the stories she'd only heard at the dinner table, telling her she had to let go of that shadow. "I understand, sir," she said finally, her voice low. He nodded, satisfied with her restraint. Good, because the army doesn't need another John Hayes. It needs Morgan Hayes. Her throat tightened at the sound of her name, spoken with such deliberate weight. The Marshal shifted, pulling a folder from the stack. He flipped it open, scanning the evaluation notes from her last exercise. Precision was excellent, he muttered, his eyes moving down the page. Instincts solid. Minor overcorrections. On a sentinel for your hours. He looked up, locking eyes with her. This isn't luck. You've got the hands for this. Morgan felt her shoulders square. I won't waste it, sir. He studied her a moment longer, then leaned back in his chair. Keep pushing. You're right where you belong. The words hit harder than she expected. For weeks, maybe months, she had been clawing for scraps of validation, burying her doubts beneath hours of practice. Now to hear it spoken plainly, Nat. She belonged. It was like oxygen rushing into starved lungs. When the meeting ended, she left the briefing room in a daze. The desert air was cool now, night having settled over the base. Stars freckled the sky in endless clusters. She walked slowly toward the barracks, her boots crunching against gravel, each step echoing with the Marshal's words. You're right. Where you belong. For so long, she had fought to prove she wasn't chasing an impossible dream. That sentence, simple and steady, had shifted everything. The next morning, whispers rippled across the mess hall. Her peers spoke in hushed tones, stealing glances her way. Some were curious, others resentful, but most carried a new caution in their eyes. That's the Night Stalker's kid. The Marshal vouched for her. She's untouchable. Now, Morgan sat quietly, eating her breakfast, pretending not to hear. She didn't crave untouchable. She craved capable. Respect was fragile, and she knew a single mistake could shatter whatever ground she'd gained. Still, the silence of mockery was a relief. The laughter had died, and in its absence, she found space to breathe. Training intensified over the following days. Morgan poured herself into it with renewed focus. Every checklist, every maneuver, every system test was performed with surgical precision. She no longer measured herself against the sneers of others. She measured herself against the standard her father had once embodied, but in her own way, on her own terms. One afternoon, during a particularly grueling navigation exercise, she caught sight of herself reflected in the Apache's canopy. Sweat streaked her temples, eyes fierce with determination. For the first time, she didn't just see a daughter chasing a shadow. She saw a pilot, yet the doubts of others didn't vanish completely. In the locker room, she overheard muttered voices. Marshal's playing favorites. She only got this far because of her name. The words stung, but less than they once might have. She closed her locker, strapped her gear, and walked out without a word. Their opinions were weightless compared to the truth she carried now. She didn't need to silence them with arguments. She would silence them with results. That evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the desert in molten hues of orange and gold, Morgan stood alone by the flight line. The Apaches loomed in silhouette, their shapes jagged against the sky. Her hand rose again to her neck, brushing. The tattoo. For years, it had been a secret vow. Now it was a revealed truth, one she no longer carried alone. The Marshal had recognized it, acknowledged it, and with that recognition had handed her something far heavier than respect. Responsibility. Her father's legacy wasn't just ink. It wasn't just memory. It was a torch, and now it burned in. Her hands. She drew in a slow breath, the desert wind cool against her face. I'm not just your daughter anymore, Dad, she whispered. I'm me, and I'm ready. The words hung in the air, swallowed by the vast silence of the desert night. She knew tomorrow would bring more challenges, more eyes watching, more doubts whispered in corners. But tonight, she carried something steady in her chest, a conviction that no sneer could shake, no mistake could erase. She wasn't flying for permission anymore. She was flying for destiny. The desert sun rose hot and merciless, throwing golden light across the tarmac. The row of Apaches gleamed as if polished by fire itself. Morgan Hayes stepped onto the flight line, helmet in hand, the weight of her previous successes and newfound respect pressing on her shoulders. But it wasn't arrogance she felt. It was determination. Proof of herself would not come from a brass commendation or whispered praise. It would come from action, from mastery, from every second she spent in the cockpit. Her peers were already lined up, checking instruments, running pre-flight drills, exchanging clipped remarks and cautious glances at her. Morgan ignored the stares. She didn't need to be noticed. She needed to fly. The mission that morning was complex. Coordinated maneuvers with multiple Apaches, a simulated urban engagement across a wide desert range. Every pilot would be tested not just on technical skill, but on strategic thinking, timing, and composure. Under pressure. For Morgan, it was another opportunity to solidify what she had earned, and to prove to herself that she belonged. Climbing into the cockpit, the familiar hum of machinery welcomed her. The tactile sensation of the controls under her fingers was reassuring, grounding her, connecting her to the lessons of months past. Every lever, every button, every gauge was a conversation she knew intimately. Her heart beat in rhythm with the rotors as she guided the Apache skyward. The formation quickly took shape, Apaches rising in staggered precision. Morgan adjusted her altitude, lining up with the other pilots, their chatter over the comms a chaotic symphony she had learned. To navigate. Target coordinates in 5 minutes, the lead instructor called over the radio. Make them count. She tightened her grip, eyes scanning for the mock adversaries scattered across the range. The sun reflected off metallic surfaces and glass, sending bursts of light into her eyes. In the cockpit, every second felt stretched, every movement amplified. The first engagement came faster than expected. Simulated hostiles opened fire from elevated positions, requiring rapid adjustments. Morgan banked sharply, then leveled her craft with precision, letting the Apache systems absorb and respond to her commands. Her cannon fired, each shot deliberate, methodical. Targets exploded into clouds of sand and debris, smoke trailing against the clear blue sky. Around her, other Apaches executed their maneuvers, but she could feel herself pacing the engagement, anticipating the next move before the call came over the comms. "You've got excellent control," the instructor barked through the headset. "Keep it up, Hayes." Morgan's jaw tightened. Praise was welcome, but it wasn't her goal. Focus, control, and precision were her only objectives. The engagement intensified. Multiple targets erupted simultaneously. Rockets streaked across the sky, leaving trails of smoke and fire in their wake. The Apache roared beneath her, and she moved as if it were part of her body. Every system worked in tandem, responding instantly to the subtle pressure of her fingertips. Behind her visor, the HUD painted a battlefield of motion, threat, and opportunity. Morgan's mind split in two. Fragments, each one managing a different aspect of the engagement: targeting, navigation, communication, stability. Her senses sharpened. Every sound, vibration, and visual cue told her what the machine needed. It was exhausting, overwhelming, exhilarating. When the dust settled, the range lay in ruins, targets demolished, objectives completed. The instructors. Voices came over the comms, clipped but impressed. "Well done, Hayes, well done." When she landed, Morgan noticed something she hadn't seen before. Her peers weren't whispering behind her back. They were watching, wide-eyed, some nodding. In respect. She climbed out of the cockpit, chest heaving, sweat streaking her face, and heard the quiet words. That was incredible. Did you see how she anticipated the movements? She's good. Really good. For the first time, the tone was different. The mockery had vanished. It wasn't gone entirely. It lingered in the unspoken, in those still too proud to admit admiration. But the dynamic had shifted. She wasn't just a girl asking to fly Apaches anymore. She was a peer, a competitor, a pilot of skill and precision. Later, in the barracks, she pored over the mission logs. Every detail mattered. Reaction times, trajectory, system responses. Morgan knew that mastery wasn't accidental. It was deliberate. She studied each moment, corrected errors, and recorded strategies for improvement. Her peers began to approach her, tentatively at first, asking questions. How did you anticipate the left flank targets? Do you have a method for synchronizing cannon and rocket fire? She answered with quiet patience. No condescension, only shared expertise. Slowly, the walls between her and her colleagues began to dissolve. Respect wasn't demanded, it was earned through knowledge, demonstration, and the willingness to act when others hesitated. The day ended with a debrief at the hangar. Pilots discussed successes, failures, and lessons learned. The instructors highlighted individuals who had excelled. Morgan's name was called first, not for her family legacy, not for her tattoo, but for her actions, skill, and leadership. She walked to the front, helmet tucked under her arm. Applause was muted, but genuine. For the first time, it wasn't awkward. It wasn't pity. It wasn't condescension. It was acknowledgement. One of the senior pilots, previously one of her harshest critics, approached her later. Hayes, he said, voice low, you're the real deal. I was wrong. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise. Morgan nodded, a quiet smile tugging at her lips. Thank you. I won't. That evening, she walked alone along the flight line, the Apaches silhouetted against the burning sky. The desert was silent now, save for the soft whir of distant rotors. Powering down, she touched her tattoo gently, the black ink catching the fading light. It wasn't just a symbol of her father anymore. It was proof. Proof of endurance, skill, and the capacity to rise above doubt. Morgan whispered into the wind, almost as if speaking to the ghosts of those who had doubted her. I told you I'd make it. And the silence that answered felt like approval. Over the following days, her confidence grew. The exercises became more complex, the challenges more demanding, yet Morgan thrived. She began to mentor younger pilots, passing along techniques, sharing strategies, and offering encouragement. Her leadership was quiet but undeniable. The tattoo on her neck no longer felt like a secret to hide. It was a banner of experience, of determination, of skill earned through sweat and focus. It was no longer a symbol of inherited legacy alone. It was her own mark, etched into her flesh, reflecting the pilot she had become. By the end of the week, the unit's dynamic had transformed. Whispers of mockery had become murmurs of respect, the subtle acknowledgement of one who had earned her place. Morgan Hayes was no longer a novice seeking acceptance. She was a pilot, carving her own legend. Late one night, lying in her bunk, Morgan reflected on the week. Each mission had been a battle, not just in the air, but within herself. She had conquered nerves, doubt, and fatigue. She had faced peers who questioned her ability, and she had emerged not only unbroken, but elevated. The Apache had become more than a machine. It had become an extension of her will, a partner in the sky, a testament to the hours, sweat, and determination she had poured into her craft. For the first time, she felt the weight of legacy without it crushing her. The Night Stalker's emblem on her neck was no longer just her father's. It was hers too, and she would carry it proudly. The sun rose over Fort Campbell like fire, spilling across the tarmac, casting long shadows of Apaches poised for takeoff. Today wasn't another routine exercise. It was the culmination of months of grueling training, sleepless nights, and relentless self-discipline. Morgan Hayes tightened her gloves, the familiar leather snug against her palms, helmet under her arm. She could feel the tension in the air, the sort of electricity that made every pilot's muscles tighten. Everyone knew the final evaluation meant something more than skill. It meant recognition, affirmation, and in many ways, survival of reputation. The visiting officials had eyes on her. Peers had doubts still lingering. The Air Marshal's words echoed in her mind. The Apache respects the pilot in the seat. Morgan was ready. Sliding into the cockpit, she felt the machine embrace her. Every dial, every lever, every sensor, it was all part of a conversation she could hear in her fingertips. She buckled in, checking systems with precise, deliberate motions. The rotor hummed to life, vibrating through her chest. Her instructor's voice cut through the comms. All units, this is the final evaluation. Treat it as a live mission. You are accountable. Execute flawlessly. Morgan's heartbeat accelerated. She gripped the cyclic, pushed the collective forward, and the Apache lifted gracefully. The desert stretched beneath her like a living map of challenge, ready to test every skill she had honed. The first challenge was navigation through simulated hostile terrain. Mock enemy positions dotted the desert, trucks, camouflaged bunkers, and high-elevation firing posts. Her HUD lit up with coordinates, threat indicators, and the positions of allied units. Morgan's hands moved like dancers across the controls, banking, tilting, correcting with subtlety and speed. Her mind was razor-sharp. Every maneuver accounted for physics, wind, threat assessment, and timing. Every second required perfect calculation and instinctive reaction. She remembered nights studying in the barracks, notes sprawled across the floor, scribbled schematics of hydraulics and weapon systems. Every hour of preparation converged into this moment. Targets acquired. She reported, her voice calm, despite the thrum of rotors and the roar of simulated gunfire. The engagement began. Her cannon unleashed fury on distant targets, missiles streaking across the desert like silver lightning. Smoke and sand erupted where each round struck. Apaches around her followed formation, but she could feel her own rhythm in the chaos, anticipating movements before they happened. Suddenly, a simulated emergency, a critical system failure, flashed across her console. The Apache shuddered. Adrenaline spiked, but she didn't panic. Fingers flew over the switches, engaging backups, stabilizing the craft, correcting trajectory. The lesson of months' discipline, control, awareness flared into action. System failure acknowledged, she reported. Recovery executed. Her instructor's voice cracked over the comms, tinged with disbelief. Exceptional. That could have grounded less experienced pilots. Morgan's chest tightened, not with pride, but with clarity. This was why she had trained relentlessly. This was the crucible her father had always known she would face. As the simulated mission escalated, enemy vehicles attempted flanking maneuvers. Morgan's eyes tracked, predicting paths, calculating timing, and aligning her weapons. Rockets, launched with precision, cannon fire shredded obstacles, and the mock battlefield turned into a controlled symphony of destruction. Her peers began to notice, not just that she was effective, but that she was commanding presence. Communications shifted subtly. Pilots deferred to her coordination, responded to her cues, followed her tempo. Respect was no longer whispered, it was demonstrated through synchronized action. In the rearview display, the instructor observed silently. Morgan's performance was flawless, instinctive, and lethal, not for the sake of kill, but for control, for mastery. The final simulated objective appeared, a multi-tiered compound with hostile targets and civilians trapped inside. Morgan's task was clear: neutralize threats while minimizing collateral damage. She adjusted altitude, angle, and weapons alignment. Compromise neutralized, she reported, targeting only the designated enemy positions. Rockets tore through bunkers, while civilian zones remained untouched. Every decision was calculated, every move deliberate, every second weighed against risk. The Apache roared beneath her, alive, demanding respect. And she delivered it. When the exercise concluded, silence fell across the desert range. Even the instructors were stunned. Morgan Hayes landed flawlessly, guiding the Apache down to the tarmac with surgical precision. Rotors slowed, vibration ceased, and dust settled. For a heartbeat, the world was still. Then the Air Marshal's voice cut through the quiet. "Outstanding performance," he said, walking across the tarmac. "You've not only honored your father's legacy, you've surpassed it. You've become the pilot the Apache respects, not a shadow, not a name. You." Morgan felt her knees weaken slightly, but held her posture. The weight of the moment was immense, but she embraced it fully. She had fought doubt, fatigue, skepticism, and her own fears. She wasn't just a trainee anymore. She was a pilot, worthy of every rotor blade beneath her. Her peers gathered around, some hesitant, others openly admiring. Words of congratulations replaced whispers of doubt. Hands shook, shoulders clapped, nods exchanged. "You earned that," one of her harshest critics admitted quietly. Morgan smiled faintly. "We all did," she said, acknowledging the teamwork and coordination that had brought them this far. Leadership wasn't just command, it was recognition of shared effort. The unit's dynamic had shifted completely. Where mockery had lingered, respect now ruled not blind deference, but acknowledgement of skill, courage, and perseverance. Later, alone in her barracks, Morgan removed her helmet and traced the tattoo on her neck. For years, it had been a private vow, a silent promise to her father, a mark of grief and determination. Now, it felt like something more, a testament. She whispered softly, almost as if speaking to the man who had shaped her from the very beginning. "I made it, Dad. I'm me. And I didn't just fly the Apache, I became part of it." Tears pricked her eyes, but she didn't let them fall. Instead, she pressed her palm against the ink, feeling the permanence of what she had built. A legacy reclaimed, transformed, and elevated. The Apache wasn't a machine anymore. It was an extension of her will, her discipline, and her courage. And she was no longer chasing anyone's approval. She had claimed her place. As night fell, Morgan walked to the edge of the flight line. The Apaches rested like sentinels under the moonlight. The wind whispered over the desert, carrying the echo of rotors past and present. She allowed herself a small, quiet smile. There would be more missions, more tests, more eyes watching. But she was ready. Every lesson, every scar, every hour of preparation had led to this. She had earned her place, not as someone else's shadow, but as Morgan Hayes, the pilot who dared to rise, the daughter who honored her father by flying her own path. Tomorrow, the world would continue to test her. But tonight, the desert held still in acknowledgement. And in that stillness, she finally felt the full weight of triumph. Morgan Hayes touched her tattoo one last time before retreating to her bunk. The Night Stalker's emblem, once a private symbol of grief and vow, now glowed in her heart as a beacon of mastery, courage, and belonging. She had faced mockery, fear, and doubt. She had conquered them all, and she had done it flying.